The Nuremberg trials were an exemplary process for the history of humanity and the method by which the greatest genocidal perpetrators of the German National Socialist regime were condemned, forever shaping the forms that international justice would take from the 20th century onwards. These sinister characters who formed Adolf Hitler's inner circle received the harshest treatment. The court, which acted on behalf of all the victims of the brutal Nazi genocide, decided to sentence 12 high-ranking military officers and officials to death for the crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Third Reich. In this way, the collaborators of the anti-Semitic German leader died, for the most part, by hanging, putting an end to one of the bloodiest eras of the modern world. Today we will tell you who these men were, what their terrible fate was, and what happened to their bodies. Let's begin.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, death by hanging. Fritz Saukel, death by hanging. Julius Streicher, death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, death by hanging. Hans Frank, death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, death by hanging.
After the Allies advanced from the west along the coast of Normandy and the Soviet Union counterattacked and made its way to Berlin, Hitler and his generals knew that their days were numbered. In 1945, the Führer, like a coward, decided to commit suicide with his wife and ordered their bodies to be burned in the courtyard of the Chancellery. In this way, the man who led a nation against the rest of the world, causing millions of deaths in the process, avoided being captured by his enemies. Two of his most important men decided to follow the same path. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda and key bishop in the spread of National Socialism and anti-Semitism in Germany, also decided to end his life before confronting the Soviets. In this case, with a rather cruel and methodical slowness, he poisoned his 6 children. Then, with the same coldness, he and his wife committed suicide. The case of Heinrich Himmler, the top leader of the Third Reich's paramilitary organization, was quite different. The head of the SS had decided to betray Hitler shortly before the end of the war, for which he lost all his ranks and was arrested in Germany, although he eventually fell into the hands of the British. Himmler had managed to go unnoticed by Churchill's troops by hiding his identity with an eye patch and a fairly convincing performance, until the English managed to discover him. After uncovering his deception, he was sent for a medical examination prior to being transferred to trial. During the visit, the doctor discovered that, like most Nazi officers, Heinrich had a cyanide capsule embedded in one of his molars. At that moment, with the intention of preventing it from being removed, Himmler abruptly bit the doctor's finger and activated the capsule with the poison, dying instantly. Many other important Nazis committed suicide with the cyanide capsule. But there were some, whether out of fear, cowardice, or simply because they believed they would get away with it, who preferred to end the war alive. These high-ranking officials and military officers, however, had to face one of the most shocking judicial processes ever carried out, perhaps the most important in history. We are talking about the Nuremberg trials, when an emergency tribunal convened by the Allies investigated the actions of 24 key figures of German National Socialism.
The International Military Tribunal, the IMT, convened in the ruined city of Nuremberg on the 20th of November 1945 to sit in judgment of the surviving leaders of Nazi Germany. The trial continued until the 1st of October 1946, when the judgments were handed down.
Of the total, half received varying sentences, ranging from a few years of hard labor in so-called denazification centers to life imprisonment. But the other 12, those we will discuss in detail in this video, were sentenced to death by hanging. However, only 10 of them were actually hanged, while the other 2, probably the most important figures on the list, never got to feel the rope burning around their necks in front of the families of the victims of their atrocities. The thing is that these characters knew better than anyone the absolutely sinister crimes they had committed, and were not willing to pay for it.
Hans Frank, former Governor General of occupied Poland.
That Frank was a willing and knowing participant in the use of terrorism in Poland, in the economic exploitation of Poland in a way which led to the death by starvation of a large number of people, in the deportation to Germany as slave laborers of over 1 million Poles, and in a program involving the murder of at least 3 million Jews.
Men like Hans Frank, whose name was lost in the ups and downs of movies and novels about great figures of Nazism, were also responsible for the terrible genocide of the Jewish people, and we will tell you about his terrible end. But first, we are going to learn about the case of the macabre Martin Bormann, one of the 2 genocidaires who was saved from the gallows, feared even by the officers closest to Hitler. He was the private secretary of the Führer, his right hand in political matters, and head of the chancellery of the Nazi Party. With this presentation, we can see that Bormann occupied a more than distinguished place in the Third Reich. But, in fact, he coordinated even deeper powers than those allowed by his designations, so all the information about what was happening in Germany, as well as the possibility of having an interview with Hitler, passed through his hands first. Bormann not only hated the Jews as much as their leader, but he also detested most religions. In fact, he was one of the greatest persecutors of Christians within the National Socialist Party, which led him to challenge many of his co-religionists, as well as trying to convince the Führer that he should exterminate the Catholic Church. Of course, because he was in charge of very relevant state affairs, his participation was crucial for the Holocaust, as we all know it, to materialize. We could say that his role was to be an administrator of the genocide. However, Bormann was never tried by the Allies. After Hitler committed suicide in the Führer bunker, the personal secretary tried to flee Berlin, but he did not get very far. He is believed to have died or been killed by Soviet soldiers on a bridge near Berlin Central Station on 2 May 1945, although his body was found in 1972 and his identity confirmed 35 years later in 1998. The remains were cremated and dumped in the Baltic Sea in 1999. During the Nuremberg trial, the Allies had evidence that Bormann was no longer walking among the living, and he was sentenced to death in absentia. As for his personal possessions, many were recovered by organizations that dedicated themselves to restoring Jewish property confiscated during the Nazi regime. Others, undeclared, passed into the hands of his family.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
We have just seen the sentencing of another emblematic case. It is about Hermann Göring, the legendary and brutal commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, who also managed to avoid the terrible noose of the gallows. Since the beginning of the 20th century, he had built up an excellent reputation as an aviator, being recognized in the First World War as a decorated ace after serving under the command of the Red Baron himself. All that was eclipsed when he culminated his professional career as one of the most sinister people who ever walked the earth. Göring had a superb capacity for strategy and combat, but he decided to put his gifts at the service of evil and gave the Luftwaffe a bloodthirsty imprint that caused great popularity at the beginning of Nazism. After earning Hitler's admiration, the former aviator managed to reach positions such as Reich Minister of Economy. After the fall of France in 1940, he was promoted to the position of Reichsmarschall, that is, the highest command of the German armed forces. But everything that goes up must come down, and beyond his excellent capabilities on board aircraft and gliders, Göring could not avoid his own downfall. All the benefits he had achieved during the beginning of the Second World War began to be threatened when the Allies launched bombing campaigns on Germany. The Reich defense plan applied by the Luftwaffe worked briefly until 1941, the year in which the United States joined the conflict. The appearance of American bombers together with the classic British fighters overwhelmed the capabilities of the German Air Force. As if this were not enough, the Eastern Front presented many crises, with the Soviets rehearsing brutal counterattacks that demanded Göring's attention. The Allies succeeded in breaking the will of the Reichsmarschall, who saw his territorial defense plan fall apart, completely outmatched by the United States. This also caused a loss of status in the eyes of the Führer, who was extremely disappointed with the poor results that Göring had shown. The real break came on 22 April 1945, when the commander of the Luftwaffe was informed that Hitler was planning to commit suicide in his bunker. In an act of extreme ambition, Göring called his leader and asked him to take control of the Reich. Adolf took this act as a betrayal and decided to remove all his positions, expel him from the party, and order his arrest. The disgraced airman was imprisoned in his home until, in the midst of the chaos caused by the German defeat, a platoon of the Luftwaffe decided to free him. Göring fled towards the American lines, with the intention of being captured by them and thus avoid falling into the hands of the Soviets. He succeeded, and the Americans found him before Stalin's men. He was taken to a prison camp and later to Nuremberg to be tried. Göring was tried for 218 days between 1945 and 1946. The trial was grueling, and although he never showed remorse, the Nazi official could be seen very depressed, in a constant state of depression. Although he was sentenced to death, he did not end up hanging. The night before his execution, he committed suicide with a cyanide pill in his cell. There are two versions of how he was able to obtain the pill. The first suggests that he bribed an American guard with a gold watch and some trinkets, while the second suggests that another American soldier received a supposed medicine for Göring from a German woman, which would have been the poison. The truth is that the truth will probably never be known, although we do know the fate of his body, which would be the same as in the cases we will detail below. The assets that the former aviator confiscated during the Reich were invaluable. Göring was an inveterate collector, and after his death, more than 135 works of art were recovered, as well as hundreds of jewels and exotic dresses taken from Jews and Gypsies, as well as large sums of money that ended up in the hands of the Allies and the organizations that restored the expropriations of the time. As we have mentioned above, the list of Nazis tried at Nuremberg extends to lesser-known but highly relevant cases. The 10 people we will present below were brutal officials, military personnel, or collaborators of the largest genocide our world has ever seen. They were all sentenced to hanging and died on October 16, 1946, hanging until suffocation in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison. 1:30 a.m. The first turn was for Joachim von Ribbentrop, Reich Minister of Foreign Affairs. Although he was hated by most of the thoroughbred Nazis, Adolf Hitler found an excellent diplomat and trusted man in him. In 1933, von Ribbentrop organized a secret meeting between officials of the Weimar Republic at his home, which would culminate in Hitler's accession to the Chancellery. Joachim was also a key player in sealing the Pact of Steel, the political and ideological union between the Führer and Benito Mussolini, thus linking the Third Reich to Italian fascism. His work also impacted relations with the Empire of Japan, despite the fact that in the eyes of the Führer, he failed diplomatically after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an event that culminated in the entry of the United States into the conflict. Von Ribbentrop was convicted of fomenting the start of World War II and operating in favor of the Holocaust. Before being captured, he hid many trophies, decorations, and valuable artifacts, but these were discovered and auctioned off as souvenirs. Later, they would be recovered by organizations specialized in archives and museum pieces, but most of the valuable items were sold again, even on the black market. 1:44 a.m. Wilhelm Keitel was the German army's top strategic authority. Although his job was to plan troop movements during World War II, The Nuremberg investigations showed that Keitel was extremely permissive, with the most brutal attitudes of soldiers. During the trial, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity, as the High Command had ordered mass shootings during the invasions of Poland and France, as well as unnecessary raids, transfers, and abuse of civilians. Called by some Wehrmacht generals as Hitler's most stupid follower, when asked why he had acted without honor, he simply replied, "As these atrocities developed, one after another, step by step, and without any prior knowledge of the consequences, fate took its tragic course with its fateful results." Unable to recognize his own actions, Keitel was executed by hanging for his barbaric attitude. 1:52 a.m. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the leader of the SS in Austria and one of Heinrich Himmler's most trusted men. Although he was a senior officer in the paramilitary organization, in 1942 he managed to be named head of the Reich Security Central Office. This put him in charge of brutal forces such as the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, the Kripo, the Criminal Investigation Office that operated internally in Germany, and the SD, the SS Intelligence Service. From this promotion, he unleashed all his anti-Semitism and incited the guards of the concentration camps to optimize the executions and increase the punishments. Kaltenbrunner's name is not so famous, perhaps because it is unpronounceable, but his role in the Holocaust was decisive in the last 3 years of the war, since his thirst for blood oiled the machinery of extermination. Little is known about what happened to most of his possessions, although we do know a curious story about them. In 2001, a German citizen found an old identifier from World War II, and when he restored it, he discovered that it belonged to this terrible genocide heir, although the current whereabouts of the artifact is unknown. 1:59 a.m. Alfred Rosenberg was one of the ideologues of Nazism, who together with Hitler shaped the key concepts that shaped the ways of being and behaving of the Germans during the Third Reich. This, of course, includes the terrible anti-Semitic spirit and Aryan superiority that led to the final solution, the attempted extermination of the entire Jewish people. Rosenberg established with academic rigor the racial ladder, which placed the Germans above all and allowed inhumane treatment of those they considered inferior races. Because his role was primarily political and ideological, he was sentenced to crimes against peace, such as incitement to hatred, war, and genocide. Rosenberg's main belongings were his manuscripts, relics of all the academic work he had done for Hitler. These were recovered and are now on display at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, United States. 2:08 a.m. Hans Frank, as we already mentioned, was another of the culprits of the Holocaust, a lawyer who served as head of the general government of occupied Poland during World War II. Little can be said about this man, but he was instrumental in creating concentration camps, establishing forced labor in them, and leading to the death of some 4 million people in his jurisdiction. Frank was tried for crimes against humanity and died crying out for God's mercy. 2:20 a.m. Wilhelm Frick was the Reich Minister of the Interior, and while he did not stain his hands with blood, he was instrumental in drafting all the laws Hitler needed to carry out his plans. This man turned the Führer's darkest fantasies into legislation, such as racial policies that allowed anti-Semitism, mass murder, the increase of the military industry for war, and all the formalities necessary to carry out the Holocaust. In 1943, Frick was replaced by Himmler, but continued to advise Hitler. Between 2:25 and 2:35 a.m. The case of Julius Streicher is very particular, as this Nazi politician did not participate directly in the Holocaust or the war, but was the creator of the most important National Socialist newspaper during the Third Reich. Der Stürmer was an extremely anti-Semitic and warlike newspaper, which was dedicated to spreading Hitler's most dangerous thoughts throughout the country. Streicher became a millionaire in the process, and much of that money was later used to reward Holocaust victims and their families. The exact time of Streicher's death is not known, as his execution was melodramatic. The politician loudly insulted the Jews present, but when he was hanged, his neck was not broken, so he died a slow and painful death. 2:40 a.m. Fritz Sauckel was a Nazi politician appointed by Hitler as the general plenipotentiary for the employment of labor. Simply put, his job was to organize the exploitation of 6 million slaves in concentration camps. Forced laborers lived in overcrowded barracks, had to work up to 18 hours a day, and were usually without sufficient food, clothing, and medical care. This included women and children. Sauckel was convicted of crimes against humanity because of this. 2:50 a.m. Alfred Jodl was one of the few high-ranking military officers to make it to the Nuremberg trials alive. His career cannot be considered particularly remarkable, as he was only one of many men in the army who accompanied Hitler on his crusade to conquer all of Europe. However, he played an important role in the invasions of Norway and Denmark, and for this, he was sentenced to death. His property was seized for historical recovery, although his wife made a posthumous claim for a pension and for Jodl's house, but only received the money. 2:59 a.m. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was the Governor-General of the occupied Netherlands, enabling all possible mechanisms of cruelty against the civilian population, in addition to the extradition and indiscriminate shooting of Jews in the territory. His role was similar to that of Hans Frank in Poland, and for this reason, he was judged in the same way. At 3 a.m, silence took over the place. A dozen men who knew how to instill terror in the heart of humanity hung by the neck in Nuremberg, in front of the righteous gaze of the victims and their families. The bodies were briefly displayed in the prison and then taken to Munich to be cremated. Later, their remains, along with those of Hermann Göring, were scattered on the Isar River, a much more humane fate than the one they themselves gave to the 6 million Jews who died brutally and unjustly during the Holocaust. Although these executions ended their lives, the damage they caused will remain forever in the memory of human history. Thank you very much for following us to the end. Stay tuned for our next video.